Welcome to part 5 of our chapter on theories of personality. In this section, we're going to talk about the humanistic theories, which are considered to be somewhat the third force in psychology. First, we would have the psychoanalytic influence. The second next major influence was the learning theories that we talked about back in the chapter 7 on learning, and then humanistic theory would be considered the third major force influencing our understanding of behavior. These theories are generally more positive than the ones that we've seen before, taking a brighter outlook on the nature of human man, not focusing on the darkness as much as focusing on the positive side of human nature. The two gentlemen that are most prominent in humanistic psychology are Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. And both of these individuals really came into prominence in the 1960s with the development and application of their theories, although in both cases, most of them really did much of their early writings in the 1930s in the case of Abraham Maslow, and the 1940s in the case of Carl Rogers. Abraham Maslow developed his theory based upon the principle that we as humans seek to self-actualize, and that this is the motivating force within us. Going back to Sigmund Freud, it was the libido and the sexual energy force that motivate us through life. And Maslow, it was more or less the notion is that we try to reach self-actualization, to realize our true potential in life and to fulfill that true potential. And you can see down here is the common needs hierarchy that Maslow created. And back in the chapter on motivation, which we have not covered, the theory is referenced there. So if you'd like to go back and take a look at what is written in the book, you're more than welcome to do that. However, he basically envisioned that there were 5 basic needs in relationship to motivating us in human behavior. And down here at the base were the physiological needs, and that was the drive for food, oxygen, water, things like that. Without those things, we wouldn't be able to sustain life. And once our physiological needs are met, then we became concerned about safety and security in our life. You kind of think back to the primitive caveman. The first thing they're worried about is if you're starving, you're not worried about whether you have shelter or security. You're focused on getting food. You're going to go out and you're going to pick berries, hunt animal, do whatever you have to do to put food on the table. However, once you have that, then you start to you figure, that caveman, if you think about it, started to look for safety and security. And then, take the food back, to a cave or a safe place, be able to build a fire, protect yourself from, night predators, things like that. And you start to think about those safety and security needs. From there, we move up to, with the safety and security needs are met, then we move up to the belonging needs, and sometimes we'll refer to these as the love needs, but it's a sense of belonging, having others around us. So sometimes we might refer to as our social needs. And going back to the caveman illustration, that once I have my food, I found that nice little cave. I've got good wood for a fire. It's kind of lonely in here. It'd be nice to share my life and share this with somebody. So then I start looking out for a mate, is to share my life, share the well-being that I have. Once we have that, then we move up to the esteem needs, and it's kind of like, well, who am I? How important am I? Your self-esteem, your self-confidence, kind of in relationship to I think that in our more modern lives, as college students, maybe when we come to college, one of the things is that we have those belonging needs. We want to join maybe a club or an organization so that we get to meet other college students and we kind of blend in. And interesting for some of us, when we join that, club or organization, what we're going to want to do is it's kind of like, hey, now that I'm a member and I can say, hey, I'm a member of this fraternity or this sorority or this club or organization, then all of a sudden we start to feel a yearning to distinguish ourselves. And maybe we'll run for office and we'll be secretary, treasurer, vice president, president of the club, is to kind of separate ourselves out. And it's not that I'm just a member now, but I am somebody of import, whether it's, a committee chair or something like that. And that's a way of reinforcing and building these esteem needs. Just the fact that you're sitting here listening to these lectures and going to college can be considered, part of developing your esteem needs. Only roughly about 24% of the American population has a college degree. And so as you work to complete this degree and accomplish it, it should elevate your self-esteem as that now you're a college grad rather than just a high school grad. And for some of you, you may decide to pursue graduate school, which will even move you into, somewhat more elite educational status, but not only gaining education, but you'll also gain somewhat to your esteem. And, going out and joining organizations, doing charity work, volunteerism work, things like that, being accomplished in your profession, being a good parent, being a good spouse, these all things can reinforce our esteem needs. And of course, at the top there is a self-actualization. That's to realize our true potential. What are the skills and abilities? What is the aptitude that I have? And am I living a full life? And it's more or less to Maslow, this was an insatiable need. It was one of those that we, are not going to meet completely, and that's the lifelong motivating force, is to self-actualize. And he used to give examples of self-actualized people such as Einstein and Eleanor Roosevelt and Gandhi and things like that. But, I would bet that if, we could, bring Einstein back from the grave, so to speak, and say, Albert, did you do it all? Albert would probably shake his head and say, gosh, there were so many other things that I wanted to study, and, it would have taken me lifetimes to accomplish. And that's the thing, is that this motivating force stays with us throughout life. We're always trying to actualize, to realize our abilities and skills. So this was the positive model that Maslow put out there, and very different in the sense of what we're motivated by, rather than driven by these dark unconscious drives and things like that. Here we are, something very positive. In relationship to Carl Rogers, he also believed that individuals seek self-actualization. He used the term self-fulfillment in his theory, very much influenced by the work of Abraham Maslow. But he felt that unconditional positive regard, as it's noted here, is an attitude of acceptance of others despite our failings. The best thing, I think, the best example we have of unconditional positive regard, maybe other than our parents in our lives, are our best friends. What makes a person a best friend? And you think about it. They give you unconditional positive regard, and in the sense that they accept you for who you are. You don't have to be the life of the party. You don't have to be anybody special. In fact, they may get a little perturbed with you when you start acting different from who you really are and saying, hey, what are you putting on those airs? Why are you trying to be different? You're a good person. Just be the person you are, and people will love you. And that's where you get this unconditional positive regard. And Carl Rogers, sitting here, felt that if everybody gave us that, then in fact we would grow up to be healthy individuals. And where we get in trouble is trying to be somebody other than who we are. And this brings us then into where he used to, in therapy, he would ask people to describe who they would like to be, and then who they actually are. And that's where we come down to this notion of ideal self versus real self. If in fact the ideal self is very close to our real self, then we're going to have a healthy lifestyle. We're not trying to be somebody else other than who we are. You think about it. When you try to step out from and try to be somebody who you really are, maybe you're not the life of the party. You're not a person that's real humorous, or you're not a person who's really outgoing, and you go to a party and you say, I'm going to make an effort to be outgoing here. And sure enough, you can go about doing it. But do you feel that it's kind of draining? Does it feel like it's stressing you? You know, for the person who's really outgoing, say, well, I want to pull back and be kind of shy. It actually takes a lot of effort or energy to do that. And so whenever we start being different than our real selves, we burn a lot of energy. We move out onto unfamiliar ground. And maybe the behaviors that we choose to try to be that ideal self, because it's not really true to ourselves, are maybe maladaptive, inappropriate, or whatever. But by just being ourselves is the most healthy way we can go. And in this notion of helping us develop then a good, positive self-concept, is that, hey, I'm okay. It's okay to be me. And once again, when people give us unconditional positive regard, we feel that way. Just as your best friend does. Your best friend says, hey, this is the way you are, and I love you for it, and I'll be here always for you. And boy, does that make life a lot simpler and a lot easier. Okay? And then, so, when we come through and when we ask ourselves, self-concept then basically is all of our thoughts and feelings about ourselves. And that notion of who am I? And when I say who am I a good person? Am I a bad person? Or somewhere in between? And that's what mounts up to what we refer to as our self-concept. Okay? In evaluating humanistic theory, which is very popular today and is still very much a part of our psychotherapy routines and underlying probably many of the self-help books that you read out on the shelves. If you go into a bookstore and if you can find a bookstore anymore, but when you go into a bookstore and you look at the self-help, most of them are positive, upbeat, and follow along the lines of humanistic theory, is to show you what a strong force it is today. They're not following psychoanalytic principles. They're not following learning theory. They're basically following this notion of self-actualizing, being yourself. And that. So it has had a very persuasive impact on counseling, education, child rearing, even in our management styles at work. And has had a positive influence then on developing good self-positive concept, developing empathy for others. I mean, Carl Rogers was very big in his therapy about being very empathic and saying that one of the ways of conveying unconditional positive regard is to show the person that you understand where they're at. Now, we all know that we have the capacity for empathy through the biological research that we've talked about mirror neurons, and that mirror neurons seem to play a key role in our ability to identify or mirror the emotions or feelings that are going on in another individual. And from there, the thought that people are basically good and can improve. Rogers was also, focused on that early childhood development, but saw people developing throughout the lifetime. But, for Rogers, though, the early child years were very important in that setting that good foundation. And that foundation was getting a child to feel good about themselves and be them real selves. And that required mom and dad to give unconditional positive regard and, to avoid those things that, well, you're never going to amount to anything, or to try to mold their child into who they were not, rather than letting their child explore and find out what their abilities and skills are. How many times you see parents go out there where maybe they never played the piano, but their kid's going to play the piano. They weren't a good athlete, but their kid's going to be a good athlete. Well, if the child has those abilities and skills, let the child explore them on their own, as opposed to forcing them in it, because then what you're doing is you're getting them creating this ideal self-image that they're going to try to work for, rather than being their real self, which can lead to later dysfunction and unhappiness later in life. Criticisms of it are somewhat similar to that we have with psychoanalytic theory, is that they're vague, subjective, and lack scientific basis as psychoanalytic theory. Individualism is encouraged very strongly here towards the in our next section, in section 6, when we talk about social cognitive theory. We'll talk about individualism versus a sense of community or collectivism. But individualism in itself can lead to self-indulgence, selfishness, erosion of moral constraints. This is all about me. I don't need to worry about other people and things like that, which is a downside. I think most of us keep that sense of individualism that, hey, if I work hard, I can be whoever I want to be in a much more positive vein. But some people will go too far, and it may erode their moral constraints where they're going to run over anybody and everybody to get there. And as we talked about earlier, that's a good characteristic of sociopathic behavior. Okay, or that it totally dominates the personality. Humanistic psychology, and the third one, fails to appreciate the reality of human capacity for evil. It really does emphasize the positive nature and doesn't look at how people might take advantage of you. And so, and some people say, well, it's too optimistic, and it doesn't focus in and doesn't warn us about the negatives that people can do. And then people prey on these people. A lot of people who get pulled into these cults and things like that are generally people that probably have a very, humanistic nature, and they're very trusting of other people and very open. And sometimes there are people out there who will take advantage of you. Okay, well, that wraps up the section on humanistic psychology, and when we head into trait theory here in part 5, we'll talk about some very familiar characters, as you can see here.